how did you first discover photography, and what made you realize that you wanted to turn this into a career?
So I studied English originally, so I didn't study photography at the beginning, I suppose. But my dad gave me like a Pentax 35mm film camera when I was a teenager, and I grew up in Brighton, which is a seaside resort in the UK. And I really enjoyed just kind of roaming around Brighton, the streets, the beach, doing street photography, I suppose, really. And I've always been very interested in like visual language and communication. So I've always taken a strong interest in film and cinematography. But I never really considered it as a career until I was a bit older. And when I was at university studying English, I actually did like a part-time, very kind of practical part-time photography course at the local college. I also remember seeing a Diane Arbus show at the V&A when I was a teenager, which really had a big impact on me in terms of the kind of power of her work, but also, how troubled she was as a person, and making that connection between often the work that someone produces and the personal life of the photographer. So I remember making those kind of connections from quite a young age.
Mm-hmm. You'd mentioned your English degree, and you also have degrees in anthropology, I think anthropology of tourism and religious pilgrimages.
Well, it's the it's the only one of its kind, travel, tourism and pilgrimage. Okay. And the pilgrimage bit was the bit I was most interested in. Yes.
Okay. So, this is, I'm an academic by training, so it's not unusual for me, but it might be unusual in the photography community. So, and it seems like your personal projects, your long-term projects, are kind of influenced by research and these more thoughtful types of subjects. So, like, how can you just like maybe riff on how has your background in English and anthropology, how has that impacted your approach to photography projects and your own work?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think when I start a long-term project, for instance, and I'm talking about these are my personal research-led projects as opposed to the commercial work I do. When I start a long-term personal project, it always begins with research. So I'm looking at films, I'm looking at literature, I'm looking at poetry, I'm looking at historical documents to really try to enrich my way of thinking. And I wanted to go back to college because I was getting a bit sick of the commercial photography world. This was before I worked on Voto, which was a big kind of turning point in my photographic career, I guess. And I decided I didn't want to do an MA in photography because I felt that I wanted to immerse myself more in the academic world. My family are all very academic, so I do come from that background, although I've never considered myself kind of as academic as them. But I wanted to be back in the library. I wanted to be in seminars. I wanted to be in lectures. I wanted to be writing and really thinking on a much deeper level about the work I was making. So I found this MA, which was, yes, the only one, I believe, of its kind, which was Anthropology of Travel, Tourism and Pilgrimage at SOAS, which is the University of London. And I suppose in lots of ways, photographers like to think of themselves in some ways as explorers or as anthropologists in some ways as well. I was always a little bit troubled by this term, especially with some of the kind of colonialist, history of anthropology as well in terms of image making. So I felt I wanted to delve more formally into what it meant to be an anthropologist. And I think it made me more aware of representation when I was making my work, of kind of ethnographic practice and things like that. And it really meant that I was immersed in an academic world that allowed me, I think, to think about image making in a different way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. You're right. Some of these older images, the history of photography is also, coincides very nicely with the history of empire. And, some of the most gruesome images that we remember, from the past are ones that are part of that heritage. So just riffing on this, I didn't prepare you for this question, but so how do you balance, this history of the kind of imperial heritage of photography and that kind of, underbelly with what you're doing? Because some of your portraiture seems to be a little bit more, a lot more, not nuanced, that's not the word, but it's more gentle. You approach the subjects in a more humane kind of way. They're not just like subjects that we're supposed to gaze at, although there is that kind of invitation there, right?
Yes, I think to a degree, although I wouldn't suggest all my portraits are collaborative, but there's a element there, a collaborative element there, certainly, partly through the camera I use, which is the very big, old-fashioned, large format camera, which isn't obviously just a quick snap. It involves very careful and precise setup. It involves me explaining very carefully to the person I'm photographing exactly what I'm doing, almost taking them through the steps. So immediately there's an engagement there that isn't just about me like making a picture of them or taking a picture of them. It becomes more than that. And also I think, I work in a very slow and considered and quite a still way and quite a quiet way and in a gentle way in some ways, but also it's always been very, very important to me, particularly as I've recently documented communities that are out of my kind of everyday life and my everyday sphere. And to a certain extent, communities, it could be quite easy to kind of label them the other to me anyway. I mean, they're mostly, white Europeans I'm photographing, but they're also from, religious communities or involved in rituals and festivities that I know very little about in one level and that is not part of my background. So I'm very aware of kind of representation. And I suppose when I'm making a portrait, even when I'm doing my research and I have in my head a kind of idea of what I might create, I'm thinking very carefully about building up a kind of a trust. And it's very important to me that I very much, respect the people who I'm photographing. So I hope there's a level of kind of dignity there in the way that they're represented. So I think, that's always, whether I'm photographing a 15-year-old kid in my local neighborhood or, I don't know, the head of the Orthodox Church in Belarus, it doesn't matter who they are. But I'm aware that in a sense, it's this privilege that I've been given to kind of represent them. And with that privilege comes a responsibility. So this is what I'm kind of thinking about while I'm composing the picture and what I'm thinking about when I'm obviously doing the research earlier. It's all kind of very much tied together.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, very good. It seems like there's a ritual involved in the act of making a photograph here. Going back to this idea of the long-term project that you do, like how important would you say that long-term projects are for photographers, like maybe photographers trying to break out of the commercial work, or just for the sense of doing something personal? Like, how important is that?
Well, for me, it's the most important part of my practice, definitely. I mean, it doesn't bring me any money. So on a practical level, it brings me very little money. I earn a little bit through print sales. I have gallery representation. I might sometimes make a little bit of money from the books I publish, a very small amount. So it doesn't, it's certainly not done for those purposes in order to make money. But in terms of it being, it's the most important work I make in terms of for the amount of kind of emotion and energy I put into it and the time I put into it, but also the kind of responsibility I take very seriously in terms of how and why I'm documenting these people and places. So for me, I mean, it's difficult because for me, the commercial worlds and the personal worlds in terms of work are very separate. And that's something I have to keep quite separate in my head, but also on a practical level. When I'm working commercially, I could often take up to 1,000 images a day on a digital camera. When I'm working with my large format camera, some days I might not take anything. I might just be sitting, observing and taking notes. Other days, I might take 1 or 2 frames with a big plate. These kind of plate cameras, you only take one shot at a time. So it's it's almost 2 ends of the photographic spectrum, really.
Right.
And for me, I find it most enriching work is definitely the work that I make, not for myself, because I hope that it obviously resonates with other people, but my personal work is definitely, I'm able to explore things on a much deeper level than I ever could with my commercial work. So although I need the commercial work on a practical level, I find definitely it's most fulfilling, my personal work. And I also actually know in terms of commissions as well, that a lot of if you're looking at the commercial world, like ad agency buyers and design agencies and picture editors, they like seeing personal work very much. And often you will get commissions on the back of that. So they kind of feed into each other. But for me, I mean, I would love him in the future to only be able to survive just through my personal work, right? Because that's the work that drives me, really.
Yeah, I teach by day, and I tell people who ask me about that, I say, well, the teaching puts food on the table, but it doesn't really nourish me. Like,
exactly. Yeah. Feel the same way.
Yeah, that's great. So what about storytelling? So it seems like in these images, and from what I've seen of your new book and what I've seen of your older books, I don't actually own any of your older books, but I've seen some online here and there. What is your approach to photographic storytelling now for personal projects? Do you have a method, or?
I don't really have like a formula, I suppose. I mean, when I first started Voto, which was my big project about European kind of Christian pilgrimage, that was a long period of research. It was actually 3 or 4 years of the images not working. I was shooting medium format, I was shooting color, and it felt like a kind of travelogue or a nice editorial. So the images for me weren't really anything special. And then once I developed this style with the black and white and the large format camera and started really trying to reflect how I was in that location, so in those kind of sacred sites of pilgrimage, that's when it kind of came together for me. So I never really know how a project's going to develop in terms of storytelling. So for me, I have an initial idea, but then it's very important to keep an open mind and almost allow the things that you discover to lead the way. So with Voto, I very nearly gave up on it altogether. And then when I changed this format, and also I think the anthropological studies have kind of fed into this, because I also, in my studies, did a lot about phenomenology. So I started thinking about our relationship with the environment and how places shape us and how almost we inhabit, landscapes as they inhabit us. And once I started thinking in that way, it changed my approach, and it also allowed me to have a kind of deeper understanding of what the pilgrimage experience meant to people. So in terms of storytelling, I mean, at the moment I'm working in a way where the focus is on the portraits, and then I tend to work around that with some very kind of quiet and still landscapes, and also perhaps some still life. So the portrait almost leads the storytelling, but I don't do kind of, storyboards, or I don't have a strong narrative before I begin a project. I kind of almost learn as much as I can about the subject, but also allow for mishaps and adventures and surprises, because you never know, I never know when I go somewhere new, really what I'm going to find or how people are going to respond always. So I think it's important to be kind of open and intuitive in terms of storytelling with photography. For me anyway, that's the best approach. But also it's very important to me that I educate myself to a certain extent and learn about what I'm going to photograph in advance, so I don't just kind of roll up somewhere without any sense of what's going on there, or any real attempt to teach myself about these other communities. Mm-hmm. So yeah. You mentioned just a few moments ago that your early photos for Voto felt to you very travelogue-y and felt like editorial work, and I was wondering, like, if you could unpack that a little bit. What do you mean by that? Well, when I first started Voto, I was mainly, in the end, the project ended up focusing on 3 different pilgrimage sites. But in the beginning, Voto, I was just visiting a very large Catholic pilgrimage site called Lourdes. It's in the south of France, so it's very well known because of a young peasant girl having apparitions, and then it became a great gathering place for Catholics over a number of years. This dates back to the 1850s. And when I first went there as an atheist, really, or perhaps agnostic, but as a person I didn't consider myself to have any particular faith. I didn't consider myself as a religious person. So I felt a kind of imposter in some ways and an outsider, and I didn't really know at that point like why I was there. So I was kind of questioning my integrity and my reason for being there, I guess. And at that point, it was really part of my research, but I didn't have a strong vision of what I wanted to photograph or how I wanted to photograph. That developed later. So in the first really 3 or 4 years, I think it was, I took some, they were kind of nice images, but they were much more kind of tentative. I wasn't confident about my approach, and they felt to me like it was it could be in a nice travel magazine or something. They were perfectly nice images, and people would have thought it looked like an attractive place to visit, an interesting place to visit, but it didn't really, for me at that point, get kind of beyond a more superficial level.
Yeah, I guess that's where it ties into having the personal project. I guess, when people go on holiday, they just snap whatever grabs them. But if you have this personal project, then maybe you have a strong vision of exactly what it is, you're going for.
Yeah, but that's what took me a really long time to develop. So it was still a personal project. So although the images looked like they were from a travel magazine, it wasn't a commission. It was me funding a personal project, but it took me many trips and actually several years to really kind of get my thoughts together almost and gather my thoughts and really decide what was I there for, really. That's what took me the longest time to really answer that question. And then once I felt I was able to answer that, and that was almost also as a result of all the studying I'd done at that point, because I also wrote my dissertation for my MA, my thesis about Lourdes. So at that point I knew it on a very different level from when I first kind of just rocked up there with a camera and a load of film, not really knowing anything about it. So it was partly developed as a result of many, many visits and kind of patience and I don't know about tenacity, but like a belief in that there was something there and there was a story to tell. But even in the beginning, I didn't really know exactly what that was going to be.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. What about capturing a sense of place in projects and photography?
Yeah, so I mean, a lot of my portraits, place is very important, but it does serve as a kind of frame or a backdrop. So for many of my portraits, the emphasis is very much on that person and almost on the gaze and the essence of that person. But I'm also very careful in terms of how I frame the portraits, that they're somehow related to the landscape and the environment as well. So for instance, with Ex Voto, Lourdes is an extremely busy place. Like there are loads of, I could have done a load of portraits in the commercial section with loads of the shops behind and people walking past. But instead what I was interested in were these much quieter moments that I'd observed where people would sit on their own for hours and they would be thinking and they would be praying, and they were often by the river or they were by a forest. So that's when I started to kind of think about these placing people I was photographing who were already in the landscape anyway. It wasn't like I was taking them out and putting them somewhere different, but choosing to photograph them in these much quieter and kind of stiller spaces that obviously then reflected, it was more of a kind of meditative take on their faith anyway. So for me, you can't really separate a person from place. And that was definitely, that kind of thought process was enhanced through my anthropological studies and studies of phenomenology as well, which is very much about obviously like lived experience, but talks about how we can't separate our bodies from the environment we're in. So I suppose that was also an influence. But yes, so I kind of started developing this style with Ex Voto, and actually now with the latest project, Gli Isolani, which is called The Islanders, which is all set in or photographed on Italian islands, mostly Sicily and Sardinia. It was very important to me because a lot of the portraits, if you like, are about a kind of man and the land and the seasons, and a lot of them have kind of connections with fables and folklore and even pagan times. So it dates back, many, many years. And it's very much, for me, you can't disconnect someone from their environment. And a lot of these costumes and the masks that they wear as part of the celebrations and festivities on these islands are very much related to the land and the environment and the pride they take in the land. So again, I was using rocks and I'm using forests and I'm using lakes as these kind of natural backgrounds. And that was also what I chose to do with my series that I did during the pandemic called Lost Summer, where I photographed a series of teenagers in outfits that they would have worn to the prom. Of course, all the proms were cancelled, and these big rites of passage, they didn't happen. But we'd been so dependent over the pandemic on these outdoor spaces that it felt that it was right to kind of, I also almost used gardens and parks and backyards as a studio to kind of frame them. So I would use trees and leaves and bushes and ivy and would frame them in these natural landscapes.
Mm-hmm. You'd mentioned this kind of the human focus or the human centeredness of your images, these quiet meditative moments that you're seeking. And I was wondering if this is part of the reason why you are drawn to the larger format, the slower process, the more kind of deliberate act of making a photo.
Oh no, definitely, because for me it becomes, like you said before, it becomes a ritual in itself, in terms of there's a few steps you have to do with that camera, and in some ways it's very simple, but in other ways it can go wrong very easily. So you have to be very focused, you have to really be concentrating on what you're doing, and there is definitely a rhythm to the way you use that camera, and there's a rhythm to the way I work. And I'm not saying I enter this deeply meditative kind of mindset, but certainly there's a connection there when I'm working and when I'm photographing that is kind of established and that I follow. So I don't think, aside from the fact that I still feel that there's a kind of depth and a tonality that you get with film, and particularly with large format, because obviously with large format you're getting a very big negative, so you're getting very kind of rich detail. And there's a quality there that I've not been able to match on digital. But more than that, in fact, way more than that, it's a different way of working. It's a different way of thinking. It's a different way of communicating with your subjects, that very much suits the kind of quiet, often quite quiet nature of the themes that I'm exploring through my image making.
You'd mentioned Diane Arbus earlier, but I was wondering if there are any other photographers that influence or inform your own work.
Well, probably all of these. I've got a big bookshelf behind me.
I can see. What do you have back there?
So I have Andrea Modica is a relatively recent find of mine. She's a American photographer working mostly in black and white, large format, and I'm a big fan of her work. I only discovered her work quite recently. If we're going back further, then August Sander is a big influence in terms of the portraits that I take. Yes, I've got the same one. Yeah. Dana Lichtenberg, she did this great book, Imperial Courts, which is set in LA, all again black and white, large format. I'm quite predictable probably in my choices. Who else? Vanessa Winship, Judith Joy Ross. She had a big exhibition. Again, she did. All these people are kind of like fine art documentary, if you had to put a label on it, I suppose. But they all, I think, photograph very kind of movingly, like the human condition, really. So a lot of them, most of their work is portraiture, but the ones I mentioned do all work on a large format camera, mostly in black and white, the same way I do. So yes, I suppose a lot of my influences are more kind of traditional in terms of their work process. But also there's loads of photographers here who are much more, conceptual or experimental in terms of their approach. So I think I'm a kind of traditionalist at heart when it comes to photography, but I also, find inspiration and influences from a wide range of photographers.